Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, I pray that you're all well. It's also nice to see all of you back in the masjid. I want to thank the Imam's office and thank the board leadership for bringing us here and keeping us safe, inshallah. May Allah bless them and having them follow the Quran and the Sunnah and Islamic tradition. Jazakallah khair to our Imam's office. So inshallah, to begin, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here in verse 257 that talking about the idea of wilaya and wali. So alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the verses previously in Surah al-Baqarah has talked about ayat al-Kursi. And as you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in ayat al-Kursi defines himself and defines his different attributes. And then we see that in the following verse in 256, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, La akraha fid din, that there's no compulsion in religion, and that guidance is distinguished from error. And those people who follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they have held on to a strong rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this verse is continuing defining himself and defining one of his attributes, and one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as we know in Ayat al-Kursi, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about how he is Hayyul Qayyum and that he doesn't sleep. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the idea of he is Wali, Al-Wali. And this is one of the beautiful names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many of the Mufassireen, they discuss the definitions. What does it mean for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be Al-Wali? And Imam Qurtubi, he says, Al-Wali is Nasir, the one that protects and helps the person. Yansuru ibadahu al-mu'mineen. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Wali in the sense that he comes and he supports and he helps the believers who are servants of his, that they have iman in their hearts. And you see that Fakhruddin al-Razi, he defines the wali. He says that al-wali لِأَنَّهُ يُقَرِّبُ مِنْكَ بِالْمُحَبَّةِ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he comes and he protects the believers because he loves them. SubhanAllah. And this is one of the beautiful things I was reading and studying, is the connection between al-wilaya and muhabba. The wali, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the one who protects. Why? Because he loves. And he is someone who brings وَالنَّصْرَ وَلَا يُفَارِقُكَ. And he's someone that doesn't leave someone. You might have a relative, you might have a spouse, you might have children, they may go and they come back. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always with the believer. There are many verses in the Quran that speak about the concept of wilaya and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wali. For instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّ اللَّهَ مَوْلَى الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَأَنَّ الْكَافِرِينَ لَا مَوْلَى لَهُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that he is the protector, the friend, the one who loves those who have faith, آمَنُوا. And the kafirin, the people that reject him, they do not have any protector. And this is important because we see that there's a connection between wilaya and iman and mu'min. Because what does the believer do? The believer believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, affirms him. He or she is the one that steps towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in prayer and worship. And that's the reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds. If someone in a relationship loves you, takes care of you, takes initiative, then you want inherently to respond to that love. You want the relationship to be reciprocal, not just one-sided. And then you see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالَّذِينَ اهْتَدَوْا زَادَهُمْ هُدًى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the believers, that the ones they've chosen guidance, they've chosen to do Islam, they've chosen to actively submit themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will increase them in guidance and increase them in protection. And here, we see that after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala discusses wilaya, he says, يُخْرِجُهُمْ مِنَ الظُّلَمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ. Allahu Akbar. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I am the wali. Not just anyone. الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. Those people who have iman, that have taken that initiative, that have submitted themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then what does he do there? It could have just been a period to stop. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يُخْرِجُهُمْ مِنَ الظُّلَمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes them from ظُلَمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ. And here, Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, he says very beautifully, he says, فَتَكُونُ الْآيَةِ صَرِيحَةً في أن الله تعالى هو الذي أخرج الإنسان من الكفر وَأَدْخَلَهُ فِي الْإِيمَانِ. Subhanallah. He said this verse is clear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings people from darkness to light. And sometimes we think highly of ourselves, that I can go and I can guide people and I'm the one that is going to do da'wah and everyone's going to listen to me. But at the end of the day, we invite, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has control of the hearts. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the power to bring people from darkness into light. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here in the verse says, يُخْرِجُهُم مِّنَ الظُّلَمَاتِ. And the Mufassirin, they focus on this. That this word is plural, it's jama'. That there are many darknesses. There's not just one. It could have been min al-dhulm, this one darkness. But it's dhulamat. There's so many darknesses in our life. There's so many things that can lead us astray. There's so many times we thought we couldn't see what was the truth and what was right. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I took you out of these darknesses ila nur, Allahu Akbar, into the light, the one light. Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the light. And we see that there's this beautiful metaphor throughout the Quran. And we say it every day in our prayer, Ihdina sirat al-mustaqim. That this life is a sirat, it's a path. And to go on that path, you need light. You don't know where you're going. When it's dark and you're driving home, what do you have to do? You have to turn on your lights. Because otherwise you wouldn't be able to get home. And that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying here. That all of us are in this sirat, and we want the sirat to be mustaqim, and we need the nur Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. We need the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us on that path of life back to Him. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. That eventually we are returning back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we see that there are other verses that talk about the wilayah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ala inna awliya Allah la khawfun alayhim wa la hum yahzunun. Subhanallah. That the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they don't have fear. They don't have this fear of worry and being afraid of what's going to happen next. And they're ones that don't have this debilitating sadness that leads them into depression. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is there protecting them. And we see that there are ahadith. One of the most beautiful hadith, we know the hadith of wilayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through the words of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, says, Inna Allah qad. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Man aadali waliyan faqad adhantuhu bil harb. Allahu Akbar. Subhanallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the words, there's a hadith here, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, whoever does enmity against my wali, the one I have in charge myself to protect, then I have declared war on that person. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He protects His people. There are people that are very possessive. If you're part of my family, part of my tribe, part of my company, I'm going to take care of you. In the same way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's going to take care of those people who believed in Him. And then He says, وَمَا تَقَرَّبَ إِلَيَّ عَبْدِي بِشَيْءٍ أَحَبَّ إِلَيَّ مِمَّا افْتَرَضْتُ عَلَيْهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that my servants, they come close to me, right? They take the initiative. And what do? That I love them because what I told them to do. I told them to pray, I told them to fast, I told them to go to Hajj, I told them to do zakah. They did those things, then I become close to them. وَمَا يَزَالُ عَبْدِي يَتَقَرَّبُ إِلَيْهِ بِالنَّوَافِلِ حَتَّى أَحَبَّهُ. Subhanallah. Allah here, this says that they continue to get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bin nawafil. They do the sunnah before Fajr. They pray the sunnah at night. They do the witr. They do the optional fast. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps getting closer to them until what? I love that person. And this is so beautiful. When I was reading this and studying the concept, the relationship between wilayah and hubb and love. That if you're going to protect someone, Allah is not simply out of His power that He protects people, but out of His love. That we have in our religious tradition, we have the concept of the wali, even in marriage. But the wali represents the couple and the bride, not out of paternalism and out of power, but rather because they love their children and they want the best for them and they want to take care of them. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِذَا أَحْبَبْتُهُ كُنْتُ سَمْعَهُ الَّذِي يَسْمَعُ بِهِ. that if I then become and I love this believer, then I become the hearing which they hear. وَبَصَرُ الَّذِي يُبْصِرُ بِهِ, and I become the seeing to which they see. وَيَدَهُ الَّتِي يَبْطِشُ بِهَا, and then their hand which they grab and hold. وَرِجْلَهُ الَّتِي يَمْشِي بِهَا, and their legs that they walk with. وَإِن سَأَلَنِي لَأُعْطِيَنَّهُ, and if they ask me something, then I give it to them. وَلَنِ اسْتَعَاذَنِي لَأُعِيذَنَّهُ, and if they ask for refuge and protection, then I come and I support them and I save them from the difficulty that they're in. So brothers and sisters in Islam, to conclude, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here in these verses speaks about the importance of wilayah, and that the believers have this protection, and that they're taken out of the dhulamat al-nur. But in contrast, the kuffar are the opposite. وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَوْلِيَاءُهُمْ الطَّاغُوتِ. But those people who reject Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and don't take that initiative, then their أَوْلِيَاءُهُمْ الشَّيْطَانِ يُخْرِجُونَهُم مِنَ النُّورِ إِلَى الظُّلُمَاتِ. SubhanAllah. Then the shaitan, he will do the opposite. They're in guidance. They can see the light, but then he will take them into the darkness. أُولَٰئِكَ أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. These people are the companions of the fire. There they dwell forever. So, to summarize, brothers and sisters in Islam, we see in these one verse the importance of this concept of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being wali. But the concept of wilayah is not simply that we say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, protect us. The question is, what are we doing? Because in any relationship, you have to take some initiative. It's easy to say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you do this, but are you fasting? Are you praying? Are we doing the basic things Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded? And if we've done those things, have we done the nawafil, the extra things, the things that are not obligatory but show that we love and we care? And if we do those things, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised to us that He will guide us, He will support us, He will be with us, and that He will be the person who protects us because He loves us. And this is so important in the da'wah, because sometimes when we speak about our deen, we speak about the halal and the haram, but all of us, even children, when you do teach them, and you, as parents, we are mu'allim, we are teachers, we're not just breadwinners and nurturers. We teach our children and we teach our families. It's important that we focus on these key attributes of love, of care, that He's here to protect us. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to succeed. And if you're feeling in darkness and confused, that He's the light of the heavens and the earth. And that you should pray to Him so He can give you His light so you can go into guidance. So one concluding thought from myself and to all of you is to make a prayer, inshallah, today and this week to Al-Wali, one of the beautiful names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Wali. He is the Nasr. He is the one that protects and He helps. And let's, inshallah, work on thinking and reflecting on this name and how it can be beneficial in our lives. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. Assalamu alaikum.